And we'll now go to Mr. Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Willett, for being here, for bringing this forward in the House. It is entirely to your credit that we're having this study, and I want to make sure that's very clearly on the record. That said, I'd like to know about the process that you went through that brought you to bring a point of privilege in the first place. Like, can you tell us what happened, what steps were taken, who you contacted, how we got here?
Yes, thank you very much, David. So on May 4th, I rose in the House of Commons on just an SO31. And it was an important issue because there was issues of violence occurring against Indigenous women in Saskatchewan and in Manitoba. Some had been killed and burned alive, set afire during parties by people who did not respect women. And in order to have perhaps a deeper impact, because a lot of politicians sometimes will raise these issues, but sometimes we're ignored. You know, not everyone hears the message. I wanted to make sure that the people who needed to hear it most, especially some young men, would hear that message. I decided to speak in Cree. And I expected, when I wrote the little speech, the 1-minute speech, that it would be translated in the House. That I would have just a simple courtesy of 1 minute to be able to express that language so that all people could understand what I was saying. And unfortunately, the interpretive and translation services were not able to provide that service because we can't do it under the current standing orders. I understand bureaucracy has a way of functioning and working, and it's important bureaucracy. But at the same time, it's important for that message to get out. And I was dismayed when other MPs could not understand what I was saying, nor were my words recorded within the Hansard. So the Hansard, I have spoken many times in Cree in the House, and it's not even an accurate representation of some of the speeches. It simply says the member has spoken in Cree. Yet I might have spoken for over a minute, 2 minutes, 3, 4 minutes in Cree. But no one knows what I said. So for me, I brought this issue up as a point of privilege to the Speaker a few weeks after that, and I came up with I spoke to a number of lawyers and people who were involved in language issues across Canada, especially people who were involved in Francophone language issues for minority linguistic rights across Canada, and learning from them about some of the processes that they had gone through and trying to find out what would relate to Indigenous peoples. I believe one of our colleagues had spoken previous to Section 35 of the Constitution Act, which states the existing Aboriginal treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. And the professor of mine, or a friend of mine, Karen Drake, has written about this extensively, and she believes that they do fall within this provision. And they have some people have even launched a constitutional challenge, arguing that not only does the federal government not have just a negative obligation not to stifle Aboriginal languages or to simply just ignore them, but also has a positive obligation to provide resources necessary for the revitalization of those languages. And I can go on perhaps in another section. I don't want to take up all your time.
Okay, I have one more question, then I'm going to throw it to Mr. Sims with some more questions as well. In the process of what you went through, did you offer to provide translated text to the translation booths that they could then read into the record as you spoke?
Of course.
And
I provided English, French, and Cree versions lined up within a chart so that it was very easy to follow. But unfortunately, it was said that as members were all honorable, but they had to have the assurance, because it is a very professional organization. It does need to have a very high standard in interpretive services, that what I said was accurately represented. And so if I had said something a little different, that it would be recorded as such in either English or in French, to make sure, obviously, it was proper parliamentary language, and also it was an accurate representation of what was said.
Well, surely saying spoken Cree is more accurate than actually what you said. Thank you, Robert. I appreciate this.
Yeah.
Just have some questions.
Yeah, just before we go to Mr. Sims, just to follow up on that, we're not having the 4 provinces because they don't do translation, but one of those provinces puts in their Hansard translation as provided by the member. So whether it's not accurate, that would be your fault, but people know that it's your translation, which is a way they've handled that.
And translating for Hansard should be reasonable, because you can translate that after the fact.
Mr. Sims.
Something to consider for our standing orders, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Robert. This was really good. I enjoyed that. As eloquent as always. We're just talking about the House, the parliamentary precinct. I want to talk about your riding, and this is the same questioning I had for Mr. Saganash when he was here. And he brought in an absolutely startling fact, which was there was no word for Member of Parliament in Cree until he showed up in 2011, which in translation was someone who represents, is the word that they use, and I find that astonishing. How do you communicate with your community, with your riding? So I want you to comment on that, Mr. Saganash's situation in Cree, and as well how do you communicate, like householders, social media? How do you do that in the languages?
So I think Mr. Saganash had an excellent point. In fact, that was actually one of the issues that I faced when I arrived here on Parliament Hill, is there was no word for MP in the dialect from the West. And so after much consultation with a number of elders, going back with some linguists at some universities, the term Otapapis Tamakeo was chosen, which means, yes, but one who represents or one who speaks on behalf of others.
Okay.
Same concept.
Yeah, same concept.
Same concept, yes. Yeah. And so Otapapis Tamakeo, it's a wonderful word. But it was difficult. Even when I arrived, I wanted to have that title actually on my door front. And I spent a long time probably arguing for about 1 year with the House of Commons administration about whether I was allowed to have that one word with English, French, and that Cree word, MP, député, Otapapis Tamakeo, at the same time. And I'm not allowed. So, you know, my staff have held my hand back from actually taking a jiffy marker to it to write it on the sign, but I will wait for the process to come to a conclusion.
My constituents do it to mine all the time. That's right, go for it.
But for the in the community, I have about 22% of my riding is Indigenous, composed of many different nations. So I have Oji-Cree, Dakota, Michif, Métis, French Métis, and many different groups from across Canada. Inuit people as well, but I also represent Filipinos. So generally we work in the English language. But I think for me the issue that we need to look at is the state has a certain role to play. And if Parliament is to be representative of people in this country and about what we are as Canadians and what we want to be, then all languages which are native or Indigenous to this land should have the opportunity of being heard in the House at some point, if it's required by an MP. And I think it's important because if people can't see themselves in the institutions of the state, then why should they be part or participate in that state? I still hear many elders say that they are not Canadian citizens because Indigenous peoples only received the right to vote in the 1960s. It's still very difficult to go in many First Nation communities to convince people that the state, Canada, is here for them, that we all work for everyone. Because they don't believe that yet. They don't see it. And so this is why I say Parliament does have this role to play in trying to demonstrate in a most symbolic way that we are all in this together.
Mr. Richards.
Thanks. Welcome. So just kind of going to your question of privilege and sort of how it all came to be. Obviously, I know the basis of it. But in sort of preparing that question of privilege and in thinking about it and making the decision to come forward with it, did you reach out to other members for discussions about that, either like before the question of privilege was raised, or anyone sort of afterwards in terms of arguing it sort of with other members or whatever before the ruling was made by the speaker? What can maybe just walk me through with that? What kind of conversations or discussions you might have had?
So I did actually have a conversation with some members in the House Leader's office just to find out what would be some of the procedures that I could do, as I'm a new MP. You know, and I could submit it to a committee, which obviously some committees are sometimes very, very busy. I understand that you have an awful lot of work to be doing. Would you have the time to study it? At what point? Would I gain enough support? And so for myself, I thought it was important to raise in the House because it was one, I believe, of absolute privilege about being understood. If I speak in the House, I expect to be understood by others, my fellow MPs, because otherwise it negates what I'm saying. It's like I'm not even there. It's like there's a dead silence or a black hole of time and words that no one understands what I say. And if you can't debate me, whether whatever our ideologies are or whatever our different ideas are, then that would serve no purpose. So it's important that I have the ability to be understood. And when I learned that the Senate has been doing this for a number of years, that other legislatures in Canada have been doing this, that there were other legislatures in the history of Canada that have been doing this. And when you read the parliamentary procedures, you learn that there is a strong history and tradition about how we conduct ourselves in our legislature. And so if other parliaments can do this, like the Manitoba legislature in the 1870s, I don't understand why we can't be doing this here in the Canadian Parliament, which has access to a large number of resources. Now, I'm not asking that, you know, $1 billion. I'm not even asking for $1 million. I'm asking for a few translators to have the opportunity of coming when it's appropriate and when it's needed to offer translation.
So you mentioned the Senate and the process that they have in place. What's your knowledge of it and understanding of it, and are you comfortable, like, was that the type of a process you're looking for in the House of Commons, or what's your position on that?
So the Senate is, they use translation once in a while as required. And so it was actually Senator Charlie Watts, who is, I'm not quite retired, or perhaps he has retired, who fought for this around 10 years ago. And he spent a considerable amount of his own resources. One of the issues that they faced was the issues surrounding dialects. We all speak a bit of a different language. But when you don't have a central state structure, and as we know, Indigenous nations in Canada do not have a central state structure. There is no central Indigenous government that everyone can come to and say, what should we speak? What is the Académie française? On parle comment la langue française? Et il y a un groupe qui disent, mais c'est comme ça. On parle français, c'est ça le bon mot pour ordinateur. C'est pas computer, c'est ordinateur. Et they decide what the words are. They decide what the word for MP is. Perhaps Mr. Saganash's word and way of saying it is better than otapapistamakio. And perhaps his word we should be using, or perhaps my word is the better word. But if you don't have the resources of the state, a central government, helping people, working in collaboration, allowing people to come together and the experts to actually come up with these terms, then these languages will die. Indigenous languages are actually dying in this country. I heard the previous witness talk about perhaps they're endangered. They're all endangered. Cree is endangered. It's one of the most spoken languages on the prairies. But if the stats do not tell the entire story. Stats Canada, I believe, gets the wrong thing because people feel an awful lot of shame because they can't speak their language. I don't speak the language very well. And I feel an awful lot of shame about that because my parents didn't teach me and they refused to teach, the grandparents refused to teach me. Because there's something, it's not useful, you don't need it, it's going to cause lots of problems. But there's also a lot of people that say, you know what makes an Indigenous person, what makes me a man? What makes me an Indigenous man? When I go to ceremonies and I can't understand what's being said all the time, what does that do inside? I sing the songs and I have to think, yes, that word means this, and what word does that mean? And then you have to translate for other people, and then they have to say, well, this you're pronouncing that word wrong, and your ancestors can't understand you, what you're saying, and you're asking for their help, but they can't understand you. And Parliament, the role that I see, my dream actually, is that in fact, perhaps we're not going to be able to save every language out there. Like, let's be realistic. But maybe we can save Tuktituk, maybe Cree, maybe Dene, maybe Anishinaabe, maybe 4, 5, 10 languages. There's others that are so far gone that the critical mass of speakers is just not there in society to even offer the professional translation services and interpretive services that would be required in a large institution like Parliament. But this is what something is needed. Sorry, I don't mean to take up all your times.
Okay, I've got a colleague here who wants to get a question in. Would that be okay,
course.
Mr. Chair? Like, I've got one more question, but would it be okay to allow Mr. Reid a little, might need a little extra time, is that?
Okay, okay.
Okay, sure, go ahead.
I dream of a day when an Indigenous person can turn on the TV, a grandmother at home, and not have to watch an English language program with her grandchildren that she's trying to look after, but she can turn on CPAC and watch the great debates of Parliament, because there are great debates that go on every day in our legislature. And to be able to turn it on and hear it in Cree, to hear it on a channel in Ituktuk, to hear it in Dene, and to be able to watch those debates and be informed about what's going on in our public institutions, and to feel proud that they can hear their language there, and the little children will be able to say, oh, they hear it in the background, it's important, that language.
Okay.
I should try and speak that language.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I've got a better understanding of sort of where your position is then now. And it ties into the next question I wanted to ask, which is, you know, I know after the speaker made his ruling, Mr. Saganash had indicated sort of, I think it was to the CBC, that he'd been working to try to negotiate a solution. Now, it sounds like, from what I've heard from you today, that maybe your goal is somewhat different than maybe I had understood it to be. And, you know, it's not simply about, you know, sort of having some interpretation provided, like, you know, I asked you about the Senate model. It is actually a broader goal than that, is to make sure that you're preserving some of the languages and encouraging their use, you know, elsewhere as well. But I just wanted to know whether you were aware of that negotiation that was taking place, Mr. Saganash referred to, and what you know about that and what your thoughts are on that.
I don't specifically know too much, but what I will say is everything has to start somewhat small. I can't expect tomorrow that we have a full interpretive service and linguistic service with, you know, 10 Cree linguists that understand every dialect and at snap of a fingers. But what I'm hoping is we build something over time, that as more Indigenous MPs become elected, and I know there's been Indigenous MPs who have been in the Conservative Party and who are Cree and who have been in the Liberal Party, and even in the NDP, but over time that it builds up, that the more and more we use it, that the opportunity becomes that, oh, you know, this is, you know, it's almost, you know, we're using it, you know, maybe 1% of the time, 5%, 10%, and it becomes something more casual, and we become used to it. And it doesn't become something that's exotic or different or strange, but something that people then, okay, now, you know, maybe we need to offer this on TV or online on its own little channel. These are things that build up over time. And so what I'm hoping is, you know, we take our time to actually do it properly, to lay an excellent foundation, because I really do want to save these languages. We are nearing the end. This is it for Indigenous languages. Even I meet people who come into my office all the time and they say, I speak Cree. And you start speaking with them a little bit and they can't carry on a conversation, yet they speak Cree. And they want to speak it, or they understand it. You know, the children, you know, I dream the grandparents can speak it and understand it. Their children can only understand it, and our kids can't do any of it.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Mr. Chair, for the indulgence on that too. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the indulgence. I have to start by saying, as a fellow vest wearer, how envious I am of that amazing vest you're wearing. A really long time ago, 25 years ago, I wrote a book on languages in Canada. It was dealing with official languages, not with Aboriginal languages. But one of the things that really sank into me was how remarkably little government measures are able to assist languages to survive and prosper, or alternatively to crush out a language which has vitality. There are many examples one can look at. An obvious one for me is the attempt of my ancestors come from Ireland on one side, and their attempts to save the Gaelic language. You know, they made it the official language of the country, and they still had great difficulty in overcoming this. It's an interesting story to look at. But one of the things that I observe with languages, and I'm throwing this out to you to think about, it may not be a good idea, you could respond, but one of the things to think about is that a language which is divided into many subsidiary dialects within the language seems to have less ability to survive. Again, looking at a European example of this, I look at the fourth official language of Switzerland, which is Roman. And the Romansh language is divided into three dialects, and that seems to have greatly weakened its ability to survive. So I'm wondering, other areas they've tried to make the languages more homogeneous within the language itself. That involves a certain amount of internal compromise. I'm wondering if that second route was chosen, whether it would help with the survival of the Cree language, which I gather has significant internal distinctions. So I simply asked that question to hear what you have to think about that.
Well, je suis d'accord avec ça. Parce que si vous allez en France, la langue d'oc existe,
Oui.
Qui est comme un dialecte, mais c'est une langue différente et beaucoup de mots francophones, français qui sont inclus dedans. Et c'est extrêmement difficile pour assurer la survie de même cette langue-là. So you're right, it is very difficult. But I think the great thing about a state, a centralized state that we have, a federation, is that there are the resources of the state to allow the linguists to actually sit down together to actually come up with the common terms. And the great thing about a parliament is we deal with everything. We have debates about everything, talking about transportation, we talk about security, we talk about, health. Do those terms always exist? Are they always the same? And so if they're not, well, it's going to force people to have to sit down somewhere, the experts, and actually sit down and say, what is the term that we actually want to use? And then it's going to have to take the education system with Indigenous affairs or Indigenous services to make sure that these words get out to the communities, to the schools, and that the teachers then in the schools use them. But then if also we know that the interpreters, there's employment for interpreters, that the universities will have the opportunity then of training people to be to a professional standard to actually offer those services. I used to have a program at the University of Manitoba. I was a program director there in the Aboriginal Focus programs, and I as a university prof. And one of our certificates was Aboriginal languages, combined with Red River College. Well, we couldn't run the program because we didn't really have any jobs for people to go to. Because there was no need. We don't need Cree. But I think if there was an opportunity, people would say, maybe I would take up that language and be a language defender, a language warrior, and go out there and promote it and use it every day. And I'll use it at home, and I'll use it in my workplace. If you look at Quebec, what they did in the 1960s, we all know their story. It's quite incredible where they went from having, ils n'avaient pas la langue française sur l'île de Montréal, mais avec la loi 101, et je sais beaucoup de monde n'aime pas la loi 101, mais qui a forcé quand même l'État et les sociétés de considérer que de parler français était important. Et j'ai vécu à Québec pendant 13 ans, et je comprends la mentalité, la structure de la langue structure nos pensées. C'est incroyable, quand je parle français, je pense complètement différent quand je parle anglais ou quand je parle en cri. C'est extrêmement fascinant. Et si on perd les langues autochtones, on ne va jamais avoir. Et des mots, il peut décrire des affaires importantes. Une fleur, à un certain moment de l'année, peut être différent. Mais techniquement, c'est la même fleur, mais ça peut être différent à un autre moment de l'année parce que les éléments qui sont en dedans, qui peuvent être utilisés pour le médecin à un certain moment de l'année et l'autre de l'année, mais ça ne peut pas être utile. Et on perdrait toutes ces connaissances-là avec les aînés. Parce que les jeunes ne sont pas capables de comprendre. On a besoin de quelqu'un de faire quelque chose et personne ne fait quoi que ce soit. C'est pour ça que c'est historique. This is why it's historic, because you actually have the opportunity of actually doing something that no one else has done before. We always talk about the importance of language, but no one actually ever takes very little action in this country. Very little resources. Because everyone's, maybe we'll do a little bit here and we'll write a little children's book here and a little children's book there with a couple Cree words and a couple French words and a couple English words so people maybe understand what's going on. But it's not enough. We need the state. We need the instruments of the state to help, because it is an important and symbolic way of supporting and making sure that perhaps these languages will survive. Not all will. I kid you not, but at least a few will. And that's the importance of you.
I see, Mr. Stewart.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ouellette, and it gave me a lot to think about my own identity too. Thinking about, so, you know, I'm a Canadian and I believe in intrinsic equality, and I think that's reflected in our Constitution. But what you're making me think about, I thought forever as Indigenous languages as perhaps your language, but now I'm thinking of it as my language. I just don't speak it. And I kind of think, so since it's my language and I don't speak it, perhaps I should try to protect it. And I think that's really the value of what you're doing here, is you're providing Canadians a chance to reflect on who they are and what it means to be Canadian, and that Canadians are people who speak Indigenous languages, and they own, you know, they're part of that discussion. So the state should reflect that, because that's what the state does. It's directed by the Constitution. It's directed by the will of the citizens. And so I think you're spot on, and I really support what you're doing here, as I've told Mr. Saganash as well. I think that, so I would really support investing in this, and I really like your idea of a CPAC channel. I think I'd probably watch that one, because I would like to learn that language. That's mine, but I just don't speak it as a Canadian. And I think you talk about your elders who don't feel Canadian. They don't know, that they've invented a word for MP now because you represent them. And I think that's what Canada has to mean in the future if we're going to move ahead. So I'm wondering if you can just, elaborate a little more on what you think the first steps are that we have to take to recognize what you've expressed as your dream.
Thank you. Well, obviously you have to come up with a report to make a recommendation
That's
to
so
the
boring
House,
now.
which is the important thing, and submit it to a vote in some form of a motion to the Chamber, like in 1956 when they decided to have simultaneous translation, interpretation of the French and the English languages in Parliament, and to make sure that when we sit in the new West Block Chamber, the People's House, that the opportunity exists for interpretive services to be there. And then the interpretive services need to get to work to convene tables where we have linguists actually sit down from across Saskatchewan, for instance in Cree and in Alberta, and from Manitoba and from Northern Ontario, and even in Quebec, to sit down and say, what are the common terms? If someone decided to say healthcare, how do we say it? What is MP? What's c'est quoi le député? What's an MP? How are we going to say it? How are we going to write it out? Are we going to use syllabics? Are we going to use something else? And let them come up with a solution. And that's, I think, the first step. And, take our time to get it right.
Could I ask you if you think perhaps we try it with one language first? Do you think that would be acceptable, just to kind of like almost as a pilot to see if we can move it through? But you think that would be too offensive to others to do?
Well, I'm not sure that there. I'm sure I'm going to have a bunch of emails and texts from people who speak various languages. But if you look at the Michif language, the Métis language, very few speakers left. There's a couple. It's on its last legs. 500 speakers. Many are very elderly. I'm not sure they have the time. Some might have the time to come up with some terms. But I think we really need to find a couple languages, maybe 3 or 4, and start to blaze the path with them.
Okay.
And I would suggest Cree and Ituktuk, Dene, and Anishinaabe, which Oji or Ojibwe, which is a common term used to describe Anishinaabe, to kind of blaze that path. Mm-hmm. And then after that, as more MPs also become elected, also that would serve as an incentive to people to become involved in the political process, to hear their voices in Parliament, to hear their language in Parliament. We need a Salish speaker in Parliament. We want to hear the Salish language. We should maybe we should become involved in the political process and, get one of our people elected to the Conservatives, NDP, Green Party, Liberals. Pick a party.
Well, thank you. And so, just to narrow it a bit, you're suggesting perhaps a four-language
I'm suggesting
pilot?
4, yeah.
And then what would be the first step that we do with those? I know you started to touch on it, but perhaps you could elaborate a little more.
Well, I think you need to get a group of linguists together to actually sit down and come up with the terms, and then to practice, do some practice runs. How would it sound? How much is it requested? Obviously, we have a little bit of a practice run going here. I tried to do something here today. I spoke in French and English, and I ensured that the gentleman was doing hopefully translation into Cree at the same time, listening to the French translation into English and then into the Cree, trying to find a way of trying to coordinate that. But, these are things that are going to have to start at some point, or could start. It's up to you. Like, obviously, I don't want to presage your
Could
decision.
I ask you one more question?
Yeah.
So we've got it perhaps narrowed to 4 languages to begin with.
Yeah.
Could we start with a certain procedure like the SO31s first to try it out through that, or would you suggest we have to do a much broader swath of interpretive?
Well, I think also that if someone's going to speak in Cree, I actually think they should probably come up with the speech a little bit previous to that.
Okay.
As well. Sit down with some of the interpreters and perhaps the linguists and say, what are the terms that you would like to use? What's an appropriate language if I said this and then talked about this? What would you be able to say? Would you understand what I'm saying? Give some appropriate lead time to people to have those discussions, because it is brand new and it's not been done. And take our time and get it right.
Okay, thank you. Do I still have some time? Okay. So I'd like to be at the first speech. I mean, if you give us a little leeway, then we can all sit there and listen, which would be great, and respond, I would hope.
SO31 sounds interesting.
Okay, so an SO31, perhaps an advanced lead on a speech for a government bill or something that you'd be able to say, I will speak next week to this or something. Any other suggestions for how we might kind of practically try this?
Well, I think you have to give a certain, obviously, I think the Senate right now has a nice system, the 48 hours notice. Even, obviously, Interpretive Services still has to compile a list of interpreters approved who can offer this service, who are around to offer this service. You also want it to be cost effective in some way. It's good to fly people in from different parts of the country for, a few moments, but, you want it to be able to be done in a way which is also good on the public purse. This is not...
Perhaps we could have a question period where we use all Indigenous languages to ask the Prime Minister a question that he knows well in advance, of course.
One day, you never know. That might be very interesting.
Okay, thank you.
Take the dream even further.
Hey, thank you very much. This has been very, as you said, in different languages, like in Nuktutuk, and the people of the Arctic have a whole bunch of different words for snow. So it's not a simple procedure, but you've really opened a very important discussion for this nation, and we really appreciate it. And we appreciate your interpreter, Darren Okamasim, Masijo.
From Beardy First Nation. He's from Beardy First Nation as well.
Beardy First Nation.
And from the First Nations University in Saskatchewan.
First Nations University, great to be here on this historic day. So thank you, Megwitch. And any closing remarks?
I just appreciate everything that you're doing. I must say, you probably didn't expect to be dealing with this at PROC Committee, and I apologize for that. I appreciate the speaker trying to find a path forward for it. There were lots of things I could have done. I could have challenged the speaker's ruling and tried to push a vote in the House, which would have been dramatic, but perhaps burning a lot of bridges at the same time. And I really appreciate all of you, the work that you're doing, and just really trying to help make this country a very inclusive and better place for all of us. So thank you very much. Tapwe Akikitwam. Hi.